Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Heaven.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee, for your kind, very favorable presentation of me. That was too nice. Actually, you told more than half of the stories I was going to tell. I think you tried to shorten my lecture today. But most of all, thank you all of you for just being here. I feel overwhelmed and humbled to see many of you here at this busy time of the semester. It is always so nice to be surrounded with such supporting and colleagues and good students. And it is, in a sense, sad to leave you, but I'm not going to leave so soon. I'll be around for a while, so I don't feel the pain of leaving, or for a while at least. Okay, a half century. Certainly that sounds like a very long time, isn't it? But as you know, half century can pass very quickly. Yes, I've been doing sociology for half a century. Actually, a little more than that if I count from the year when I entered sociology department at the Seoul National University in 1960. At that time, I hardly knew what sociology is about. I just wanted to become a journalist, and my high school teacher told me that sociology may be a good subject to major in. So I chose it. And the reason why I wanted to be a journalist is because I thought a journalist is a professional, intellectual profession. And more important, I thought the journalist can travel abroad. At that time, it was very difficult to travel abroad. And I had a great desire to just go outside of Korea and travel. And I thought becoming a journalist may give an opportunity for me. So I entered sociology department at Seoul National University. But at the time, in early 1960, there was not much teaching or learning going on, even such an elite university campus, the liberal arts college at Seoul National University. We had very few books to read, and the professors taught just straight from their old notebooks. Many classes were canceled without any reasons announced, and the students were busy demonstrating, first against the Syngman Rhee's government, and then after that against Park Chung-hee's military government. You may remember the only all the members sitting in this room may remember what happened in April 1960. That was when I was a freshman. And I remember vividly on April 19th, I was entering the campus in the late morning, and I saw the large crowd of the students coming out to the streets with holding shoulder to shoulder and shouting down, step down corrupt Syngman Rhee, or down with the dictatorial government, and they just shouted and pouring into the street. And I was stunned. And then I did not know what to do, and then I saw in the crowd my students shouting to me and join in. So I had no choice but not to join, so I joined. And this crowd marched all the way to Blue House, the presidential palace, and where they met other students coming from other campuses joining there. And we confronted combat police for a while, for about 2 hours. And then suddenly we heard the gunshot sound, and then we saw people in the front row collapsing to the ground. So my friends and I just ran, just ran away. On that day, about 100 students were killed by the police. And a couple of days later, Syngman Rhee stepped down and he came to Hawaii to die. So that was the story of my first year on the campus. So this 419 student demonstration helped to establish a democratic government, but this feeble government did not last more than a year. In 1961, Park Chung-hee came to power through a bloodless military coup, and therefore college campus became mobilized again in resistance to military rule. So I had a politically exciting time during my college year, but no time to study sociology or any other subject, actually, for that matter. But upon graduation, I was successful in getting hired by Chunghwang Daily newspaper, which was just founded by Samsung Conglomerate Corporation. And then I was assigned police reporter position, and I worked as a police reporter a little less than 2 years, covering news on crimes and all kinds of problems in a rapidly growing city of Seoul. It was exciting years, and I enjoyed playing a tough police reporter role, going beyond my usual gentle demeanor, I would say, and discovering many dimensions of social life in Korean society. But slowly I came to realize that newspaper reporter job is not what I expected. I realized I did not enjoy really reporting the news themselves. I wanted to sit down and think about this news and analyze the background of this news and their social implications. So when my frustration and self-doubt about journalistic profession began to grow slowly, some totally unexpected blessing came to me. One day, I got a phone call message from my professor at Seoul National University. His name is Professor Hae-young Lee, asking me to visit him. When I visited him, he asked me whether I would like to continue with the study and whether I would like to go abroad for study. Strange enough, that is something I have never thought about, because I had no one around me who was in academic profession, and I had no dream of becoming a scholar or professor. I did not have any role model at the time. But anyway, I answered to Professor Lee that yes, I'm very interested in continuing my study, and certainly I'll be happy to go abroad, but my family situation and my financial situation doesn't allow me to do that. And then Professor Lee said, well, there might be a possibility to get some fellowship from University of British Columbia in Vancouver, because there is a Korean professor in the sociology department at UBC, and he's interested in helping a Korean student to get financial assistantship if Professor Lee recommends one. So he recommended me, and I managed, luckily, to have received the fellowship and left newspaper job and came to Canada. Professor Lee passed away a long time ago, but I can never be thankful enough for what he did to me. He is the one who opened the door for me to academic career and to sociology profession. Anyway, I was able to receive the fellowship from UBC and left to Canada. So my sociological career started at UBC in 1967, so exactly 50 years ago. I was happy when I arrived in Vancouver. Such a beautiful city it was, and a huge difference I witnessed between the country I left just now, still very poor country, and the affluent and civilized country that I arrived in. In fact, it was at the UBC dormitory I came to use the Western style toilet for the first time in 1967. more impressive to me was seeing that hot water flowing out of the faucet. In at least by the time I left, Korea did not even have cold running water easily available to many people. Or how much I enjoyed taking hot shower every morning in the dormitory. I was so happy that I sometimes sang a song while taking shower in the dormitory. So I became a very popular guy in the dormitory, actually. But academically, I had a hard time because I came with a little sociological knowledge and poor English. But luckily, my newspaper experience gave me many sociological insights and helped me to compose my arguments clearly and at least logically. The first sociological research I undertook as my MA thesis was on the student movement in America. As older members in this audience know very well, the 1960s was a period of active student movement in the United States and Europe and also in Canada. It started in Paris first and then moved to US, and then University of California, Berkeley campus became the leading center of the movement. Coming from Korea with the 4 April student movement experience, I was naturally very intrigued and interested in the movement. It was hard for me to understand why these guys in such an affluent and democratic country were engaged in mass demonstration. My first reaction was that they might be just spoiled guys with no understanding how lucky they are compared to people in other countries. But slowly I came to realize what they were demanding was more genuine democracy, which means restructuring power relations in every sector of the society. So I tried to analyze documents published by Berkeley's free speech movement to examine how students' activists conceptualize ideal power relations. But it was a little too ambitious project for me, given my level of English and my conceptual and methodological skills at that time. So unfortunately, I have to confess, could not complete my master's degree before I left UBC. Fortunately, my advisor was very impressed with my work, and he wrote a strong enough letter for me to get admitted to Northwestern University with full financial support. Northwestern University department at that time had several well-known professors interested in social change in third world countries, so an ideal place for me. I enjoyed graduate program at Northwestern very much, but again I had trouble in selecting my dissertation topic. I wanted to do research on social issues in Korea, which was rapidly industrializing at that time, but did not know what topic to choose. Then again, by a happy coincidence, my professor at Northwestern told me that there is someone at University of Hawaii, Manoa, who is a Korea specialist and is looking for research assistant who can administer his survey on rural urban migrants in Korea. He was Herbert Behringer. So that was my connection to UH Manoa. I conducted a survey on rural migrants in provincial cities in Korea. At that time, migration from rural to urban areas was a very important social phenomenon in Korea, as in many other developing countries. Kindly enough, Herb Behringer allowed me to use the data for my dissertation, but I was not particularly interested in the typical agenda of migration research at that time, which was to find causal factors of this migration. The usual explanations were in terms of the so-called push and pull factors. Push factors being the poverty in rural areas, and pull factors, more opportunities in urban areas. Instead, I was more interested in finding out how migrants adapted to the urban occupational structure and tried to achieve economic advance. In that regard, I was very interested in the occupational sector composed of all kinds of self-employed people. like shoe shine boys, street vendors, market traders, bicycle repair persons, small restaurant owners, innkeepers, and the like. I knew Korea at that time, and even now, had a large proportion of its urban population engaged in self-employment, and many of them are migrants from rural areas. In fact, this was the case of my parents and many of my relatives. I realized that Western literature paid hardly any attention to these people. So I decided to write my dissertation on this neglected category of people, but I had no theoretical and methodological ideas how to make a dissertation out of my vague ideas. Thus, when I submitted the first draft of my dissertation proposal, my tentative dissertation advisor at that time showed no interest in working with me, and he was very critical of my topic. So I chose another dissertation advisor and continued to struggle. But gradually, I came to develop a clear idea about two important functions of self-employment in a developing country. One is that self-employed means self-creation of jobs. In a less developed economy, where there are not enough jobs and no welfare protection, people cannot afford not to work. They got to work and earn a living in some way. So all kinds of petty entrepreneurial activities represent a creative adaptation to that kind of structural condition. Another function is that small business provides a channel of upward mobility for many people who are handicapped in terms of education, migrant status, or other factors. Many people with these handicaps can still work hard and become successful in climbing up to the middle class. By the way, this is the way why many ethnic migrants in the United States or elsewhere enter small business. So I managed to produce a decent dissertation and got a first job at the University of Memphis in 1973. Subsequently, I extracted an article from my dissertation and was able to publish it in Social Forces, a highly reputable journal in sociology, so I started all right in my academic career. Interestingly enough, 1 year after I finished my dissertation, I came across an article published in 1973 by a British economist working on African economic development. In this article, the author, Keith Hart, coined a new term, informal economy, which became very popular, very important concept in development literature. When I read this article, I couldn't be more struck. I thought he and I were exactly of the same mind in recognizing the significance of a large number of self-account workers in developing economies and the positive role played by this small business sector for the economy and for the society. Still, there was one important difference between Keith and me. As an economist, he stressed the positive role of informal sector for economic development in less developed countries, and he criticized the policymakers and international donor organizations for focusing too much on the formal sector, neglecting the informal sector. On the other hand, my argument stopped at pointing out social functions of the same economic sector without making any powerful policy recommendation. So this experience made me realize that economics, after all, enjoy a higher status than sociology in academic ranking. Alas, it was too late for me to switch to economics. But I have no regret. I love sociology, and my genuine interest is always in sociological issues. But anyway, my salute to economists who sometimes make very powerful knowledge, good for society, although many economists do the opposite, I think. The 1970s and 80s was an exciting period for scholars working in the field of third world development. On the theoretical frontier, there were important theoretical shifts in the development literature. Until that time, the dominant theoretical approach was what was called modernization theory, which looks at human societies moving along a single evolutionary path toward modernization, in which the Western developed societies provide a model to follow for the underdeveloped countries. Thus, modernization theorists assume that in order for less developed developed countries to achieve modernization, they must abandon their tradition-bound attitudes and adopt the value system and institutions from the advanced Western societies. When I was studying this theory in my graduate years, I was instinctively resistant to this Western-biased view of history, but I did not know how to criticize it. Then from the early 1970s, this conservative theory was challenged by dependency theory developed by Latin American scholars. This theory has turned modernization theory upside down, arguing that the reasons why Latin American economies were underdeveloped was mainly because their economies were dominated by the United States and were prevented to pursue more independent and healthy course of development. Around the same time, Immanuel Wallerstein and his colleague in the United States developed a similar but more broadly conceptualized world system theory. Wallerstein argued that capitalism is basically one system with its own logic and mechanism, and it is composed of three categories of economies: core, periphery, and semi-periphery. Like dependency theorists, world system theorists argue that core periphery relations are basically exploitative relations and that scarce resources flow from the periphery to the core economies. I found these theories very interesting and tried to engage with them by bringing the East Asian cases. I thought East Asia's newly industrializing countries shared some similarity with Latin American dependent economies, but East Asian economies, of course, somehow managed to achieve rapid industrialization and were moving from the periphery to the semi-periphery of the world system. I published a few articles in which I tried to explain this puzzle by pointing to certain unique internal factors of East Asian countries, including the existence of strong state, the successful destruction of the landlord class, and strong nationalism, and the existence of well-educated and disciplined labor force and the like. This was a period when I developed contacts with several sociologists working on the political economy of Latin American development. But a more important development that occurred since the 1970s, and which was important to me, was the rise of East Asian economies. Following the footsteps of Japan, 4 East Asian economies, including South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, adopted export-oriented industrialization in the 1960s and had achieved rapid economic growth since then. But it was not until the early 1980s that their development pattern began to attract great attention from economists and sociologists in the third world. By that time, the development pattern in the so-called East Asia's Gang of Four, or Four Little Tigers, Four Little Dragons, became a big subject of debate among developmental scholars. The question was, what made this East Asian economy so successful, while the rest of the third world countries remained in poverty and underdevelopment? The answer was not simple, but developmental scholars were divided into 2 camps. One group represented the neoclassical economists, who hold the tenet that economy can prosper only if it is allowed to operate according to the free market principle, with little government interference as possible. They believed that the 4 East Asian tigers were able to achieve such a rapid economic growth because they adopted export-oriented industrialization strategy, which fits their comparative advantage in the world market and because the government did not meddle with the economy. The state policies that were implemented, in their view, were generally market-promoting rather than market-distorting policies. But this kind of explanation was not convincing to many people who had a better knowledge of what was going on in East Asian economies. What they saw in the East economy was that the extensive intervention of the state in the market. The state was more than a regulator or a referee in the economy, but the main player and the goal setter and enforcer of the rules in the economic gain. The East Asian states typically adopted a series of 5-year economic plans and selected target industries to promote. The state maintained tight control on financial institutions and allocated fund according to the state-selected industries. Chalmers Johnson, the author of the famous book, The MITI, and the Japanese Miracle, MITI stands for Ministry of International Trade and Industry in Japan, coined the term developmental state. The developmental state, in its conception, refers to a state that is strong in its organizational capacity and is independent from powerful interest groups in the society. And this developmental state puts economic growth as the state's top priority and carries out a long-term economic policies consistently, assisted by a competent economic bureaucracy staffed by the best brains in the society. I was in the early 40s when all these exciting ideas were emerging. Yes, I was much younger than now, and full of energy and eagerness to prove myself as a promising scholar. At that time, I moved to UH Manoa in 1981, which made my family happier, and it helped me to establish myself as an East Asian specialist. In the 80s, I published several articles in reputable journals, including the one in American Sociological Review. In my writing, I tried to present more complex picture of Korean development than what was usually presented by neoclassical economists or statist theorists. I argue that it was not just the market mechanism or developmental state, but the interplay of economic, political, and social factors that can explain economic development in South Korea as well as other East Asian NICs better. Among other factors, I stressed the role of the class structure in Korean development, pointing to the fact that by the time Korea embarked on export-oriented industrialization in the early 1960s, it did not have a powerful landlord class or any powerful organized labor, and that the Korean class structure was very fluid and egalitarian, which made people to have a strong aspiration for social mobility and work extremely hard to achieve that. The fact that Korea's developmental state could enjoy independence and autonomy was due to the weakness of class power, which did not exist in most Latin American countries or in South Asian economies. Luckily, my writings were well received by developmental scholars and have been used frequently in their graduate seminars. So I was slowly included in a network of influential scholars working on political economies of third world development. Thanks to these works, I was appointed in 1985 to the chair of the Joint Committee of Korean Studies at the Social Science Research Council, which was a very important organization in area studies at that time. In that position, I was able to organize in 1986 a research planning meeting on the political economy of East Asian development in the SSRC's New York office by bringing together the top-notch scholars in the field like Peter Evans, Ellis Amsden, Stefan Haggard, and the like. It was an exciting period for me. I received many invitations to well-funded conferences and colloquia, and later on, a totally unexpected one-year fellowship at the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Studies, where I spent about the best year in my life, actually. One important project I had in the late 1980s was to produce an edited volume on Korean development. Despite a growing interest in Korean development, there was absolute paucity of books that represent a well-informed analysis of social and political development in South Korea during the developmental decade. As a chair of the SSRC's Korea Committee, I felt the responsibility to produce one such a book. So with generous funding from the SSRC, I was able to put together an excellent team of scholars in the field, including Carter Eckert and Stefan Haggard at Harvard, Bruce Cummings at Chicago, Jangjip Choi and Woo Chang Kim at Korea University, and Chung In Moon at Yonsei Universities. They are truly the most distinguished scholars in the Korea field, so we were able to publish a highly successful volume titled State and Society in Contemporary Korea, which Professor Lee Sang-hyuk mentioned. Around the time we published this book, there occurred another important theoretical development in social sciences. In 1985, a well-known Harvard sociologist, Theda Skocpol, and UC Berkeley's Peter Evans published an edited volume titled Bringing the State Back In. The book signaled a turn to state-centered interpretation of social transformation away from the previously popular society-centered approach to social change. Of course, the statist theory was already popular in the field of East Asian development, but now the state has been brought to the center of attention among many theorists. In Europe, the writings of Habermas and other scholars stimulated resurgent interest in state and the role of the civil society in broadening and deepening democracy in mature capitalism. Reading this literature, I thought that Korea had an interesting case to contribute to theoretical debates in this field. So in one chapter I contributed to our book, I developed the notion of strong state and contentious society. I challenged the common assumption held among European and American scholars about the typical state-society relations in East Asian countries. They commonly assumed that East Asian countries have a strong and domineering state, but a very weak, passive, and compliant society. This is why they assume that these East Asian countries had achieved rapid economic growth, but very retarded democracy. The argument I presented was that state-society relations are not necessarily zero-sum relations, and that strong state does not necessarily mean a weak society. In the case of Korea, I argued, the state is indeed strong, but the society is not necessarily weak or docile. In recent history of Korea, we have seen continuous mobilization of students, intellectual peasants, and industrial workers against the state, which they considered illegitimate, corrupt, and undemocratic. I argued that Korean society could better be described as a contentious society rather than as a weak and passive society. I'm still pleased that I coined that term. That was the only my own invention of one concept, which was well accepted. Now, entering the 1990s, my interest gradually moved away from economic and political development to a more uniquely sociological topic that had been in my mind for a long time. More specifically, I decided to write a book on the Korean working class formation. Somehow my interest in sociology has always been in social class issues. So even when I was analyzing Korean economic development and democratization, I looked at those phenomena from a class perspective. In that sense, I guess I am a genuine sociologist because class is the central concept in sociology. Anyway, my motivation to write a book on the Korean working class was because labor issues were almost totally missing in the large volume of literature on East Asian development. When labor was mentioned in the literature, it was most often in terms of the Korean economy's comparative advantage by possessing the well-educated and hard-working labor force. Labor was taken as one factor of economic development, but how individual laborers have worked under what kind of conditions and how they struggled to achieve justice in the factory system were of little concern to scholars and policymakers alike. So I thought it would be very important to have Korean workers' side of the story told to the world. Another motivation for my book on the Korean working class was the book I read long time ago during my graduate school days at Northwestern University. It was The Making of the English Working Class, written by a British Marxist historian, E.P. Thompson. This was truly a magnificent book. In this book, the author eschewed a simplistic Marxist view of class, which regards class as a simple product of the exploitative relations between capital and labor, and instead demonstrated that class is made by a complex historical process in which traditions, cultural habits, political ideologies, and state power all influenced how workers experience their lives and how they interpret their interests and how they construct their collective identity and consciousness. I was deeply impressed by reading this book and harbored a secret dream of writing this kind of book someday when I become a mature sociologist. So around the time, when I read E.P. Thompson's book, there occurred a shocking event in Korea. On November 13, 1970, a young tailor named Chun Tae-il committed a suicide by putting himself on fire in protest against inhumane conditions in the factory. While his body was engulfed in fire, he shouted, "We are not machine. Let us rest on Sunday. Abide by the labor laws." Chun's death provided the watershed for the emergence of the grassroots labor struggle and the involvement of students, intellectuals, and progressive church groups in the labor movement. The way Korean working class movement has developed since then was dramatic, interesting, and I'm very glad I decided to write a book on this book. It took 10 years for me to complete my book, titled Korean Workers, with a subtitle, Culture and Politics of Class Formation. As I look back, my first article on labor-related topic was published in American Sociological Review in 1990, and then my book was published in 2001. So it exactly took 10 years. Of course, I did not spend all the time on this subject. I was still working on the topic of Korean political economy and state-society relations. But I did spend lots of time collecting data and interviewing many workers and labor activists, some of whom became prominent politicians, like Sim Sang-jung, who was a presidential candidate for the Labor Party in the election 2 days or 3 days ago. Through this research, I learned a lot about so much pains the Korean factory workers had experienced, so much injustices going on behind the facade of Korea's economic miracle and so much courage and self-sacrifice many students showed through their involvement in labor struggles. Okay, I'm almost finished. But if you're not too tired by now, may I tell you a little more about what my book is about? Professor Lee said it's a very interesting book you must read. This book is not really about Korean labor movement. This book describes how the new independent movement was developed since the 1970s through the end of the 1990s. But my real interest is not in the union movement, but in the Korean workers' experiences in the process of industrialization, how they adapted to the new world of factory work, how much they suffered from harsh working conditions, how they began to be keenly aware of the injustice in the capitalist system of production, how they learned the importance of organizing themselves in order to protect themselves, and how they began to develop a collective identity and class consciousness. These changes did not occur easily or smoothly. For Korean workers, it was very difficult to acquire class consciousness, class identity and class consciousness, because Korea's cultural, ideological, and political environment were inimical to such a development. Korea's Confucian culture treated factory workers as a low, menial class and taught them to be obedient and submissive to patriarchal authority in the factory, while the state extolled workers as industrial warriors, 산업의 전사, and urged them to work hard and dedicate themselves to the national goal of building a rich and powerful country with a facile promise that they'll be rewarded when the economic pie grows much bigger. But it was the incredible amount of labor exploitation and inhumane treatment of workers in the factory that brewed intense resentment and anger among the workers and led eventually their collective struggles for justice. To give you a sense of how horrible the working conditions was in most factories in the early days, and I suppose even today in many workplaces, let me cite one statement made by the protesting workers in one small company in 1976. In the protest meeting, they read this: "Please let us work no more than 12 hours a day. We know that the labor law prescribes 8 hours of work. But considering the company situation, we are willing to work up to 12 hours. But more than 12 hours is just too much for us to bear. On top of that, we are frequently assigned to double shift and forced to work 18 hours some days." How incredible. They had to beg to work only 12 hours, only 12 hours. But amazingly, Korean laborers were willing to work such a long hours in the most arduous working conditions, receiving very low wages. This is a situation Chun Tae-il protested against and demanded the government to intervene and to correct the situation, but had been repeatedly ignored and ridiculed. He was driven to take such a dramatic action to draw society's attention to the plight of the helpless workers. But it was not just the wretched condition of work that troubled the workers. They were more tormented by what they called inhumane treatment, 비인간적 대우, and the contemptuous attitude of society toward them. Here is one more citation I would like to read, which was made at the union struggle at Dongil Textile Company in the late 1980s. "Please listen to the desperate cry of our poor workers who are struggling to live like decent human beings despite society's cold treatment and neglect and under the employer's cruel treatment. We want to live like human beings, and although we are poor and educated, we have learned the justice and democracy through our union. As we can see, workers' desperate cry for humane treatment, workers' desperate try at that time was for humane treatment rather than higher wages. And they were complaining about society's neglect and condescending attitude toward factory workers. In the 1970s and up to the 1980s, Korean factory workers were often called 공순이 or 공돌이. Very contemptuous labeling about the factory workers. For many young female workers who came from rural areas with a strong desire to earn money to help their families and hope to continue their work later, nothing troubled more than this contemptuous label of 공순이. Workers tried desperately to leave factory jobs to shed this humiliating identity, but that was not easy. I thought this kind of cultural and symbolic oppression is a key in understanding the depth of workers' resentment and how Korean industrial workers eventually developed their collective identity as 노동자, factory worker, but with some ideological tone in it, not as industrial warriors, as the state wanted them to think of themselves, or not as 근로자, just meaning company employees, as their employers recommended them to use to obscure their proletarian identity. One of the most interesting aspects of the working class formation in Korea was the active involvement of outside groups, primarily church groups, progressive church groups, and the students. This was particularly important in Korea because Korea had no strong artisan organization or artisan culture that played a leading role in the European working class history. In the absence of its own leadership and in the face of powerful state, Korean workers sought a moral and organizational help from the religious and intellectual communities. What is particularly remarkable in the 1980s was the large-scale involvement of students in the labor arena. Thousands of students dropped out of the college and entered the industrial arena as factory workers. They had to hide their identity and worked as normal workers, enduring all the abuses and humiliations on the shop floor. But their chief motivation was to raise class awareness and political consciousness among the workers, and to channel workers' protest, workers' resentment toward democratic union movement. Understandably, these students turned workers, who were called disguised workers by the government, had to sacrifice tremendously. Many were expelled from their schools, although they were mostly elite school students. They were blacklisted for future employment. They were often imprisoned and tortured. And most important, they had to give a deep disappointment and agony to their parents. But amazingly, that was the dominant student culture during the Chonduhan period in the 1980s. The generation called 336 was born in that political culture. Eventually, the broadening alliance among students, workers, and distant intellectuals led to the downfall of the Chon regime in 1987 and to the massive uprising in the fall of that year. The new chapter of the Korean labor movement started from that time on, but my book finished at around that time. I ended the book with my observation that the Korean movement, union movement, was at the crossroad. It could develop as a genuine working class movement and work for the welfare of the entire working class and for the deepening of economic and political democracy. Or alternatively, it could develop as a narrow interest group working primarily for the privileged workers in the large companies, neglecting the interest of other privileged workers. Sadly, the way Korean movement has developed since then betrayed the hope of many of us had in the earlier days. Anyway, as for my book, it was well received. It received the book award from the American Sociological Association, and it was immediately translated into Korean, Chinese, Japanese, and Thai. And this book was also brought to me a stream of lecture invitations from many universities in the United States and abroad. Most honorable, I would say, were the invitation from Harvard University and Brown University as a speaker in their distinguished lecture series. But the most memorable lecture I gave was at the Beijing University in 1910. Invited by the Beijing University Students' Organizations, I gave a lecture in a large auditorium of 200-person capacity with a completely filled up, enthusiastic audience. It is because labor condition in China today is very similar to the 1980s situation in Korea, and Chinese students are agonized about what they could do about it. They are very inspired by the courageous Korean students in the 1980s, but find their political control in China today too prohibitive. So, that's the story of my life. I had a good life in many ways, and I thank God for that. I am particularly grateful for having been a professor of sociology. I have a genuine passion for sociology, and having been able to work in this profession for a long time, surrounded by good students and good colleagues like you, was a great blessing to me. Moreover, I feel extremely fortunate to have worked as a sociologist during the time of Korea's great transformation. Korea's dynamic transformation in the past half century constantly brought all kinds of inspirations for my research and writing. Although I'm retiring from active teaching, I hope to continue my research and writing, not on labor issues anymore, but on broader social changes occurring in post-industrial and globalizing Korea. Currently, I have a book near completion on the Korean middle class. So that will keep me busy for a while, and I'll be around for a while with you guys. Thank you so much. Yeah. Little too difficult question to answer. What I learned is the complexity of history. Many times you are overjoyed by toppling the government, like Syngman Rhee government, and then genuine democracy we created turned to be nothing. So democracy or radicalism and all the things, I don't know. You have to wait and see. And I truly believe that the civil society must mature to make that kind of change really work in the right direction. Just changing or the government or electing certain kind of person as a president or someone, that does not really solve the problem. And history is full of contradictions. That's what I learned about.
Would you please express your disappointment with the current state of the Korean workers? You said the hope was not fulfilled, so please explain that.
Yeah, as I said, there are two ways the labor movement can develop. as a labor movement for the entire working population, or as a union representing employers of certain companies, certain corporation, or certain industry like that. Unfortunately, Korean unions developed from the 1980s as enterprise unions. And it was because the government wanted to have the unions like that, because they found more easier to control. And they was afraid of powerful industry-wide unions occur. So they just broke down the unions into enterprise unions. And then after 1987 democratization, then what happened is that workers in large, heavy chemical industries like Hyundai, automobile industry, Hyundai shipbuilding industry, and other conglomerate firms, they have built a very powerful unions, and they are primarily concerned about the interest of their workers. And especially in the recent time with the neoliberal restructuring of the economy, job security becomes very, very serious, even for the white-collar workers and even for the workers in large companies. So unions are more narrowly oriented to protecting their workers, and union leaders can be elected only if they cater to their workers rather than the broad segment of the entire population of the workers. And then in the labor market, many companies implemented the flexibilization policies and created many temporary jobs, daily jobs, and irregular workers. And these irregular workers were employed in the large companies and doing the same kind of work, but they were denied the unions. And the unions existing there do not include them, and they just prefer to have the temporary workers as more or less as a buffer for them. So for variety of reasons, because of the interest of the, and then large companies find it, big conglomerate companies made enough profits to use their profits to keep the union members passive and docile. So they are willing to pay pretty good wages for these unionized workers. And then union workers cooperated with the large firms and allowing company to use many subcontract workers and irregular workers. So somehow the interest of the government and the big corporations and the unions collaborated and created this kind of union movement. So this is a very, very difficult situation to change, and that is a very unfortunate phenomenon.
Never heard of it. Well, that's good.
And doing his art. What is he trying to find?
You might be covering the lens.
이야기를 선택하면서 개인 이야기하고
One, two, three.
Three. One more. Yeah. Okay. Okay.